Welcome to Ira's Everything Bagel, where I talk with intriguing people about everything, their passions, pursuits, and points of view. Writing books is a solitary experience, and my guest has written many. Ghostwriting books is different. It's collaborative, not solitary, yet my guest has also written many. Glenn Plaskin is a New York Times bestselling author of 30. Can you imagine 30 books, including Horowitz, the biography of Vladimir Horowitz, and Turning Point, pivotal moments in the lives of America's celebrities. His favorite is Katie, the true story of how one dog turned 5 neighbors into a family. It's available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and all the usual places. For everything about Glenn, go to glennplaskin.com as well as ghostwriteyourbook.com and katiebook.com. And you can follow him on X, Facebook, and LinkedIn. And Glenn, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
I'm delighted to have you on as a guest because a few of my guests in this last year praised you because you helped them put their books together, to write their books. And the more I read about you, again, 30 books that you've written, which is quite an inventory, as opposed to my no book, which is also quite an inventory. Zero. But how did you get started in the world of book writing? Because you clearly came from a different world.
Yeah, I really wasn't studying or intending to become a writer or an author or an interviewer. I was studying classical music, and I went to a conservatory of music for 9 years in a row. And when I was around 25 or 26, I decided that I didn't want to do it. Of course, my mother and father said, "How can you quit now? We put so much money into your education," you know. But I was very filled with nerves when I performed. And I knew what was going to happen. I was going to wind up being a teacher. So I had an idea to write a book about the most famous pianist in the world at that time, who was Vladimir Horowitz. Now, I had never written anything. I had never published anything. I came to New York just with my idea. And I called up 15 publishers, including Jacqueline Onassis at Doubleday, who was an editor then. And they all liked my idea. And I always tell people, you're not selling yourself. You're selling your idea. My idea was very marketable. And then I went to the William Morris Agency, the talent agency.
Right.
And I met with the chief literary agent. I remember he almost laughed at me. He said, "Well, what have you written?" I said, "Nothing." "Well, what have you had published?" I said, "Nothing. Don't bother me with details." And then I pulled out my list of publishers. Well, to make a long story short, he sold it, to my utter amazement. And suddenly there I was with a book contract. And I knew I needed credibility. So within about 6 months, I called the editor of the New York Times Sunday magazine. And I told him I was writing this book and I had a great idea for the magazine taken from the book. Well, they published it. And that was the first thing I ever had published, was in the New York Times. And when the book came out 3 years later, it was so life-changing, honestly, for me, because I went from being a student mentality suddenly to being, a professional in the world. And the book was on the front page, of the New York Times art section, the front page of the Washington Post and the Chicago Tribune, and all over the world. And I thought, wow, just a couple years ago, I was a student, and now I'm, doing this. So it was very life-changing for me. And then when it all finished, my agent said, "Would you like to write another book?" And I said, "No." I hate writing books. What I want to do is interview celebrities. And that consumed me for the next 10 years in newspapers and magazines and columns. I interviewed so many, beginning with Carol Burnett and Elizabeth Taylor and Lena Horne and Mrs. Reagan and Katharine Hepburn and many, many hundreds of them. And that became my specialty. So that's how I went from classical music to writing.
When you were interviewing all these people during that phase of your career, did you find, because I noticed that when I do a lot of interviews, or I call them conversations. I don't like to interview people. I like to have a conversation with people. But I find that there's an interesting dynamic that happens, and I was curious whether you faced that as well, or noticed it, is that when you're talking with a subject of an interview, there's a rapport that's established during that time. I'll call it the magical time, for that half hour, 2 hours, several days in case of if you're researching for a book, or even over the phone. And there is that connection. And then afterwards you bask in the afterglow because you've received a lot of information that you could use for a book or an article. But at the same time, you're not necessarily going to be speaking to that person again. But during that time you're talking with them, there is that connection. Do you get that as well?
Yes, it's a very intimate rapport that you can establish with someone. And I always tell people, don't ask questions. First of all, try in the first 5 or 10 minutes to establish, some rapport. For example, when I interviewed Lionel Richie, he was late. So there was a big Steinway grand piano in the room. So I was a pianist, so I started playing something. And when he came in the room, he said, "Oh, wow, you can play the piano." And so that was an instant connection.
Sure.
Or when I met Elizabeth Taylor, she walked down the stairs and came up to me. And I said to her, long before the interview started, I said, "Oh, you have such beautiful skin." And she said, "Would you like to touch it?" So I started touching her skin. And I said to her, "Well, what is your secret?" And she said, "My secret is sesame oil. I put sesame oil all over my face." And then I noticed she was wearing this Krupp diamond, which was this 33 carat, very famous diamond. And I said, "Is that the diamond?" And she said, "Yeah." She said, "Would you like to try it?" I said, "Yeah." And she took it off her finger and just tossed it to me. And it's moments like this, or when I interviewed Meryl Streep, I walked in the room and she said, "I'm watching I Love Lucy reruns. Would you like to join me?" So I sat there on the couch watching I Love Lucy with her first. Or when I interviewed Paul Newman, he answered the door and he asked me if I would help him make some ice cubes. And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, tonight's my daughter's birthday and we're having a party." So I was standing in Paul Newman's kitchen, filling up the trays for the ice. And these are the moments that, you always remember. Or when I interviewed Mrs. Reagan at the White House, this was not long after the president had been shot. And she was at a very vulnerable emotional place. And you had to be very careful how you handle this kind of thing, no less with Secret Service people around you and, White House secretaries and stuff. But I had this ability to totally focus on what I was doing and always making eye contact with the person and viewing them not as a celebrity, but as a person with feelings and, sensitivities. So that interview with Mrs. Reagan, it's now in the Reagan Library, but it was emotional with her talking about things like that. I remember once I always used to get to lunch early to make sure I liked the way the room looked. And one time I was having lunch with Joan Collins at the Ritz Hotel in London. And I told the guy, "This is an interview. I'm going to record it. So would you put us in a corner table, something very quiet?" And so he had the table all ready. And then she walked in this white suit and this huge white hat. And they led her over to this table. And she said, "Why are we sitting here?" I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "I didn't get dressed up so I would be hidden." She wanted everybody to see her.
Of
And I'll
course.
give you one last one. Judge Judy only wanted to be interviewed in a bagel shop, which I thought you'd be interested in.
Exactly.
And I said to the publicist, "But why are we going to do the interview in the middle of a bagel shop?" That's where she wants to go. So there's a bagel shop in New York called Tal's, Tal apostrophe S. And I went to Tal's, and when I got there, Judge Judy was sitting there and she gave me her order. She told me what to get her. And I went up to the counter and got her a bagel and her cream cheese, and then came back to the table. And with all these people staring at her, that's where the interview took place. So these are all kind of unique backstage moments.
Yeah, you never forget them, as you mentioned earlier. Before I talk about your new role or your additional role, I guess, as a ghostwriter, what was it like meeting when you first started? And you mentioned you met Jackie, well, we call her Jackie O or Jacqueline Onassis or Jacqueline Kennedy. What was your take when you first sat down with her and pitched the idea of the book on Horowitz?
And had two lunches with her too.
Nice.
Um, with both of them with Calvin Klein, the designer, who became a close friend of mine after our interview. And we were trying to talk Calvin Klein and Michael Jackson into writing books with Jackie O. Michael Jackson did do it. Calvin Klein did not. But anyway, when I first met her, I called her on the phone. Can you believe in those days you could pick up the phone and call the publisher? I explained why I was calling, and she literally picked up the phone. And it was a little surreal because I idolized her, you know, and she'd been through so much, and she was so I was always stunned every time she called me on the phone. She was just so down to earth. Hello, this is Jackie. I said, oh, hi, how are you today? And it was like stunning that she'd be calling a complete nobody like me, you know. And she did not buy the book. She did not buy it because she didn't think that I was old enough to write it. So when the Horowitz book was published, I actually messengered one over to her apartment building with a note. And she immediately sent me this most beautiful note in the mail, inviting me out to lunch to discuss other projects. And I did it, and it was so exciting meeting her. I met her once before, and the thing that impressed me about her was that she was just so down to earth. I remember once we were walking down the street toward the restaurant, and we were a little early, and she said, "Why don't we take a walk?" Well, we got to the end of one block, and there was a photographer waiting. And she took one look at the photographer, and she said, "The walk is over." And we just turned around and walked back into the restaurant. And I'll never forget when we walked into this French restaurant called Lutèce, which was a very beautiful, exclusive, you know, sophisticated restaurant where you would think people in the restaurant would be used to seeing celebrities. When she walked in, I was standing behind her, and I looked at people literally drop their forks. It's like, what? So I throughout many of the years I've interviewed celebrities, I've always been a little amazed to get past the image you have of a celebrity in your mind and the reality of what they're like actually in person. Sometimes they look the same, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they're taller or shorter than you expect, you know, sometimes they're not. But the one thing that you touched on that I agree with you on is so often after 2 hours, there was an intimate connection between us, and it didn't end. That was one of the secrets to what I was doing. I would keep in touch with these celebrities for years. I would interview them again. I interviewed Al Pacino twice. I interviewed a number of these people 3 times, and I would keep in touch with them, and they would become friendly. They would come to my book parties. Calvin Klein hosted one of my book parties, and Judge Judy came to it. So it wasn't just like I do an interview and then that's it. In my case, I tried as much as I could to cultivate an ongoing thing. The one I did it the most with was the actress Katharine Hepburn, one of the legends of Hollywood. I sent her my book, and she called me up one day and she said, "Hello, is this Mr. Plaskin?" And I said, "Yes." She said, "This is Katharine Hepburn." And I said, "No, it isn't." I thought she was kidding. I mean, I thought it was one of my friends playing a joke on me. And she said, "No, it's really me." And she started talking about my Horowitz book on the phone, the biography of this pianist. And she invited me to lunch. Well, I was petrified. And I went over there for lunch, and she was very engaging and very fun to be with. And over the next, I think it was 8 years, we would do multiple interviews together. I would sometimes bring people to meet her who wanted to meet her, like Calvin Klein wanted to meet her. Peter Jennings from ABC News wanted to meet her. And I would bring these people over for lunch. And she was very funny. And the last day I ever saw her after lunch, she looked up at me and she said, "You look better than you used to." And I said, "Oh, Miss Hepburn." I said, "Miss Hepburn, is that a compliment?" She said, "You can take it however you like."
Yes, of course.
I thought it was very funny. So,
Oh,
and
when
I
you
was
were
also very friendly with Leona Helmsley. They may have called her the Queen of Mean, but I love Leona. She and I did a big interview in Playboy magazine when she was being prosecuted for tax evasion, and she was never mean to me. She was incredibly charming and fun to be with. I remember once I had a couple of friends who wanted to meet her, and I said to her, "There's a couple of friends who want to meet you." She said, "Let's get in the car." We got in her big limousine. We went over to my friend's house. They opened the door and they almost dropped dead
I bet.
because there was Leona Helmsley.
Well, here's a thought that, and I'm going to use Jackie O as the example. When you're sitting there with her And you talked earlier about seeing someone as a human being rather than just the image. But what must go through your mind because of someone like her is not that you're sitting in front of a human, but at the same time, the history that she was involved with over the years. And that's got to play in your mind somehow, that you're sitting there again, having a lunch, a meeting, and at the same time, this is history in front of you.
One of the best examples of that is I interviewed Ted Kennedy, Senator Kennedy, a number of times, and also Joan Kennedy. And one night after dinner with Ted Kennedy in his house in Virginia, he was feeling very warm and expansive. And he said, "Why don't you come into my office?" We went in his office, and there are all the photographs of his dead brothers. His brother Joe, the president, Bobby Kennedy, and filled with photos and memories. And I remember sitting in that room with him as he was talking, feeling it was a bit surreal, honestly, because it was a part of history, I guess. And then I remember he walked me out to the driveway, and then we were waiting for the car to come get me. He stood with me. He didn't want to leave. He kept talking to me, and he was incredibly warm and friendly. And I was always amazed because when I was growing up, I had a low IQ. They told me I would amount to nothing. I got all D's and F's in elementary school. The principal told my mother that garbage collectors could be happy too. And my mother's expectations for me were high, but my chances seem low. And I always tell people, so often I think people feel minimized, or like they're not good enough. And I don't honestly think I would have ever gone to the trouble of doing anything I've done, the books, the interviews, had I not felt badly about myself, because I was trying to make myself into something. And I found I had this weird ability to connect with these people, not in an authoritative way, but more in a kind of laid back, kind of more relaxed way, where they actually would tell me more.
It's also a trusting way, and you're not perceived as a threat, which I think is helpful when you're doing that kind of work. Now you're in the world also of ghostwriting. How did that start? Because you've written, as we mentioned, 30 books. And I'm going to try and get into Katie towards the end, but I want to get into your career as a ghostwriter because, as I mentioned earlier, some of the guests I've had on, you've helped write the book, co-authored or ghostwritten the book for them.
Right.
That
I'm not even a ghost, because my name is usually on the front cover
Right.
also. So
Is there a better
I
term to
call
use
it
than ghostwriter, or you okay with that?
collaborator.
Okay.
Yeah. But some of them were ghost written, some of them aren't. But anyway, the idea here was that I interviewed a celebrity once who liked what I did, and they said, "Well, I want to write a book." So they hired me to write a book for them. And then that's how it started. And then another one came to me from a completely different world, and I wrote a book for him. And I found it was actually fun collaborating on books. And so people have come to me from every possible career, law, medicine, business, psychology. And I seem to be like one of those lizards in the jungle that can change colors according to the climate. So I could write all different kinds of books. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
And I know you've had some guests on recently who wrote memoirs. Um, and I always tell people everybody has a story to tell. Everybody has a book inside them just waiting to be written. If we're honest and open, we all have lives that are filled with many different things. And so my goal as a ghostwriter or a collaborator is to try to bring out the true emotion of the story. We need the facts, but we also need the feelings. And it's a slow process. Sometimes it takes between 8 and 12 months. It's like putting a puzzle together sometimes it's very frustrating. It's not easy to do because there are times when I actually feel overwhelmed and I think, oh my God, I'm never going to be able to finish this thing. But then eventually, somehow, I don't even can't explain it. It's like a show you're rehearsing on Broadway, and suddenly the whole thing just snaps together and you're ready. And so it's always a wonderful feeling, if you write a book, it's a tangible thing you can hold in your hand. It's kind of unique. The first time I held a book that I had written, it kind of gives you the chills because you think, wow, here it is, all finished and printed. So it is exciting, I think. And ghostwriting, I guess, is a big business uh, for some. Um, and I have done a bunch of it, and I find it enjoyable because I'm not just working alone.
Exactly. It was, I mentioned in the introduction, the collaborative aspect of it. The I would imagine the challenge for ghostwriting or collaborative work is that you can't get back to writing your own book by itself. And I don't know, do you have another book for yourself in the pipeline?
Oh, well, in the midst of all this, I did write my favorite book, as you mentioned earlier.
Katie.
Yes, this book it's not really about my dog, but it's called Katie Up and Down the Hall. And what it's about is the concept of family. Your family, I say, is whatever you want it to be, young or old, straight or gay, human or canine. And in this book, I make the point that, many of us are not with our biological families anymore or completely, but your family could be your friends, your colleagues, whoever it is. And in this book, I live in this building on the Hudson River in New York. And on my floor, I made very close friends with this 80-year-old woman down the hall and her husband, and a little 3-year-old boy who had no mother, but he had a father, and me and my dog. And the book traces what happened to all of us over a period of 16 years before, during, and after 9/11. And it's about the concept that, this little boy, the grandmother became his mother, and we became a little nuclear family. And although the book ends somewhat in tragedy, as things sometimes do, it has a lasting message that these relationships that you have in life are never lost.
I like the idea. Have you received any kind of communication from people who have read the book and enjoyed it? So it'll be either by email
Oh my
or
God,
through your website.
hundreds, hundreds. The book was on the front page of the publisher's catalog. It was in People magazine, it was on television, it was in a lot of different places. So I've heard from so many dog owners. In fact, the book launch was sponsored by the American Kennel Club. So dog owners knew about this book. And the idea of my dog was that she was kind of like a mascot. She united us all through, going up and down the hall and going in and out of each apartment. And I had so many adventures with the dog, and all the adventures are in the book. But I heard from everyone from Ivana Trump to Judge Judy, from Mariah Carey to Calvin Klein, all kinds of people, and regular non-celebrities too. People would write me on Amazon, and they would send me emails, and they would tell me that the book, really touched them because, they have a dog who A, B, C, and D.
Right.
And I would always answer every note, and I would offer them. We had these special chocolate dog bones that were made. They're not for dogs, they're for people. And I would send them out to people. And anyway, the book was the most fun thing I ever did. I wrote it in 5 months, and it didn't take too long to write it because it came right out of my brain. And it came out in other countries too. It came out in Germany and China and Indonesia and Japan and other places. So it seemed to hit a chord. It came out in China too, yeah. The irony, I thought the funniest thing was each time the book came out, it wasn't my dog on the cover. They would put whatever dog they felt would sell the book on the cover.
Of course.
And I said, but how can you use, a golden retriever? Because my dog was a Cocker Spaniel. They said it makes no difference.
Right.
I
Well,
guess dogs are universal.
Yeah, absolutely. When you mentioned earlier about holding your first book in your hand and realizing it was done. It's definitely a different feeling than an article you've written or an interview you've done on television or radio or on the web. Do you get, and I occasionally ask this question of authors, and I think it's perfect for you, given the fact that you've written 30 books and written X number. Do you get a sense that by writing a book, and when you held that first book, that you get a sense of immortality, that this book will be around long after you're gone?
Well, I never really thought of it that way. I don't think I did. It's more just a sense of accomplishment, like seeing the finished product for me. It's kind of funny if you come in my apartment or living room, there's bookshelves and they're lined. This isn't because of my ego, but I decorate with books. So I like the way like 20 of the same ones look in the shelf. And it's a way for me to store them. So it's like I'm
Sure.
using these books as wallpaper, you might say. And also I give them as gifts sometimes if somebody comes over and I think that there's a book that might fit their area of interest. I had one experience that was so surreal. I did a book called Practice Law Like an Iron Man, and it was written by a young lawyer. And his idea was because he was an Ironman competitor, he would apply the principles of that to opening a law practice. It was kind of a unique idea, and it was not easy to do. And he didn't write it at all, really. He gave me a bunch of notebooks with things to put in the book, and then it was up to me to create a structure for the book and to write it. Well, anyway, the book came out, and I thought it was really good. It had a lot of motivational principles in it, and you know, I think it was good, and he's super, super nice person. And would you believe within a year of the book being published, he was riding his bike one day, part of the Ironman thing on the highway, and he was killed.
Mhm.
It was a hit and run accident. Driver did not stop, and he's the father of two young children. And that's the only time I've ever experienced one of my authors dying. And I thought, well, there's an answer to your question. This book, at least, is part of his legacy, right?
That's a great way to leave it. Yes, indeed. My guest has been New York Times bestselling author Glenn Plaskin, author of 30 books and ghostwriter of many others, including his favorite, Katie. It's available on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, and all the usual places. For everything about Glenn, you can go to glennplaskin.com as well as ghostwritebook.com, and you can follow him, and katiebook.com, and you can follow him on X, Facebook, and LinkedIn. And Glenn, thanks for being on the show.
Oh, it was a pleasure talking to you. Thank you.
Thanks, and join us every Thursday for a new schmear on Ira's Everything Bagel.